So today is May 9th, 2017, and I'm reporting on a few reports released this past week from the Detroit Free Press and National Public Radio. First, we're hearing of news regarding actress Jane Fonda visiting Detroit to push for a $12 minimum wage. Then we've got NPR tuning into the inequality debate by posting a cunning story entitled "Life Expectancy Can Vary by 20 Years Depending on Where You Live." Now, I'll get to the talk on the minimum wage in just a moment, but I want to first talk about the fact that NPR is beginning another inequality headliner by stating there's more grim news about inequality in America. The grim news is apparently that there are people across America who are living shorter lifespans than others. Now, 20 years is a wide range on average, but if we're going to better understand the data, we must first comb through it to understand the differences between these parts of the country, what people are doing differently, how their lifestyle and preferences may differ. Ironically, the report points to a number of these differences. Counties with the shortest life expectancy tend to have communities that are poorer and less educated. The lowest is in Oglala, Lakota County, South Dakota, which includes the Pine Ridge Native American Reservation. Now, I've taken the time to investigate the latest census information for Oglala, Lakota County, and I've discovered that Native Americans comprise at least 94.2% of its population, with the white population posting 4.5%. The report goes on to say, with every passing year, inequality, however you measure it, has been widening over the last 34 years. The author then states the reasons for the gap are complicated. Yes, this is true. These outcomes are not indicative of a bad in and of themselves. Allow me to explain with a simple example. Assume I were to offer you a residence where you are sure to be offered, at no direct cost to you, 3 square meals per day, access to educational resources, a proximate job, absolute security, healthcare, and a near guarantee of reaching age 64. How would you feel about this arrangement? In the political sphere, this is almost certain to arouse applause and celebration. In reality, I have just characterized life in the general prison population. As it turns out, freedom is valuable, and it may bear striking results. Moreover, residents of the United States are diverse, not merely by the complexion of their skin or their racial, ethnical affiliations, but by their cultural or individual preferences for certain activities or customs, inclusive of diets, exercise, smoking habits, and material interests, which combine to yield these magnificent headline disparities. Of course, previous generations of these groups might envy the advances of their successors' life expectancies. Yet this fails to at all capture the enjoyment of one's life. Neither income nor life expectancy, not even a local poll, can accurately determine the true quality of one's life. And as it turns out, there has been a gradual plateauing of the average life expectancy in the United States since 1965, largely attributable to the hefty costs and liabilities built into the operations of any hospital practice and the limited profit exposure undermined by federal regulations, malpractice laws, and the ubiquitousness of Medicare, Medicaid, and the growing socialization of medicine, which has ironically discouraged practitioners from extending treatment to low-income indigent persons at a discounted rate or at no direct cost in a voluntary fashion because of the aforementioned liabilities and accompanying price desensitizations of doing business in the modern commerce. Here's a bit of food for thought. From 1930 to 1960, 30 years without Medicare, the average life expectancy of all Americans increased by 4 months per year. Since 1970, 5 years after the installment of Medicare and the concerted war on poverty, the life expectancy of the United States has increased a mere 2 months per year. Despite the evidence that medicine in the early to mid-20th century yielded greater advances in the average life expectancy than the decades that followed, some will still firmly grip their precepts promulgated by the Communist Manifesto. To those, I inquire, at what cost? When will we have lived a long enough life? By what age will we realize diminished returns in form of enjoyment? Will we be pleased once we reach an average age of 100 years, 150 years, 200 years, heck, maybe even a full millennia of life on Earth? I believe that, as economics shows through the law of diminishing returns and marginal output, people, whether consciously or subconsciously, are capable of assessing the amount of risk to which they wish to expose themselves and across which interval of time. I am not at all convinced that a life expectancy of 100 years or 200 years would independently equate to an improved quality of life. There is surely a point at which individuals would decide that hospital expenses are no longer warranted to sustain life. This is the very threshold at which any quantifiable measure of hospital expenses will reveal the collective preferences of civilizations. For the purpose of any life is to be determined by the idiosyncratic, personally defined dispositions of the person, not of the collective. And as such, there may in fact be a number of lives which were short-lived, yet tremendously impactful while they were lived, and as their legacies were carried forward. Again, this is a matter of personal preference, risk tolerance, and value-based judgments. This is not a matter for governments, much less an opportunity for discerning inequality. Now, the next victim of this podcast will be the popular protests in support of the minimum wage. Before we explore the intricacies of this subject, though, I am compelled to say this. Perhaps the greatest depravity of the busy political machine is its unwitting evisceration of dignity, passion, personal sovereignty, and responsibility in its patrons. Its furtherance of the notion that civilization owes someone something purely because of his or her existence, and its affirmation of the foregone conclusion that statistical inequities are phenomena subject to remedies administered by the tool of government behind the barrel of a gun through the systematic guarantee or threat of coercion. It is through this celebrated tool of supposed righteousness, that quasi-Orwellian set of virtues whereby justice, education, defense, and welfare are promoted by their mere titular appearance on script, their utterance from the bully pulpit, or their awe-inspiring etchings into federal buildings, that the layman has been led down the road to serfdom and soft despotism. The psychoses engendered by these social rectifications, at best a secondary concern for the sponsors of the legislation, equate to externalities over which those legislators bear hardly any responsibility for the abstract, unintended, or inconspicuous damages caused by their ongoing, unabashed agendas. On balance, the legislator is convinced by his passion, his conviction, his deeply embedded and politically profitable belief in himself and in his conceptualization of nirvana, that he has effectively subconsciously and unknowingly justified or outright dismissed the lesser known or vastly unknown costs of his bid for re-election. The minimum wage law, for example, is a form of legislation intimately rooted in traditions of economic failure and disproportionate disenfranchisement. Even a 1923 Supreme Court decision ruling that the law violates the U.S. Constitution and the freedom of contract. However, lawmakers hold steadfast to their campaign slogans hinged to popular and tempting models of equality, however physically or notionally untenable. And for those disciples of free enterprise, it is political suicide to speak honestly and to endorse the abolition of this harmful price floor on wages. As it turns out, in politics, it's hardly about achieving these objectives, but more precisely about convincing constituents of the next phase of augmentation, which will then, and only then, drive civilization to that place of perfection. Of course, by then, there will be a host of additional distractions, excuses, and procedural hiccups to shoulder the blame for the administration's failures. Of course, by the mere fact that no two objects, whether physical or theoretical, can ever occupy the same space and time. One can never possibly dream of, let alone realize, equality. This will scarcely limit the ambitions of those who wish to ascend to public office. This phenomenon is not limited to the public sphere of influence. In our daily lives, we succumb to a deluge of marketing techniques which intend to convince us that our lives will be made more practical, majestic, or Hollywood-esque by a more chic handbag, a more programmable watch, a plusher set of linens, a sleeker car, a smarter phone, a smarter thermostat, a smarter diet, and overall a smarter life. American life has dramatically transformed from an ethos of discipline to a gotta-have-it culture of consumerism rooted inextricably in an inertial cycle of encouraged debt-financed consumption accompanied by a sort of culturally desensitized acceptability of extravagance without any serious attention paid to the total costs of this behavior. I contend that a lot of these outcomes stems from the increasing abstraction of earnings and the product of labor, and thence the distorted costs of capital, debt, and risk-taking. All of this is the consequence of the complete and utter abstraction of the monetary system and the total economy, the nature of wealth and savings, what they mean, and how they are created. This also ties back to the discussion on the minimum wage law, which is demonstrably and categorically regressive in legislating laborers out of the workforce and, consistent with the law of supply and demand, decreasing the total demand for unskilled laborers, extinguishing their comparative marketable advantage against more expensive skilled laborers, while depriving them of the skills, experience, and capital exposure, which might then enrich their future capacity to accrue and produce wealth. Again, we are back to the abstraction effect, the gratification of present, even nebulous wants at the expense of the future's potential outcomes and viable testable means. In summary, it's far more palatable and far easier to sell the here and now than that which one can hardly imagine. Ultimately, though, these agenda items are sold at the unquantifiable expense of liberty and voluntary association, a hefty price tag for outcomes unconfirmed and misunderstood. Rest assured, this won't keep the enthusiastic groveler from marketing his political snake oil and pandering to the classes who fail to understand how much they have to lose because they haven't committed much energy to contemplating how much they could gain of their own might.